Welcome back to the almost decentest chess course on the entirety of YouTube. Last time, we went over the general story of the dragon, why you should or shouldn't play it, how it got to where it is today, everything like that. And today, we're going to actually dig into the meat of the theory and try to gain a better understanding of how it works as an opening. And to do that, we're going to look into what's most commonly played at the lower levels, which is the closed Sicilian. Now, that begs the question, what is the closed Sicilian? So, the Sicilian can generally be divided into three categories that white chooses from. You have the open Sicilian, the closed Sicilian, and the anti-Sicilians. And we'll go through them in order. The open Sicilian is when white, usually via knight f3, plays for the d4 pawn advance. Kingside knight comes together to help the queen pawn push. And after captures and the knight captures, we get this position which is a bit more open. White has a small space lead, a small developmental lead, and all of the mainline theory is here. However, at lower levels especially, but even in general, white tries to avoid these lines because this walks directly into the things black will be most prepared for. 3 of the videos of this course are going to be dedicated to this line, if you will. But those get complicated quick, and it's a better idea usually to start with the stuff that you'll see more, and that's a bit more simple, which is the closed Sicilian. The closed Sicilian is when, instead of developing the kingside knight and going for a quick central push, white decides to develop his queenside knight to c3, and then oftentimes either not push d4 or delay it by a number of moves, pushing f4 sometimes, or just playing slow chess in general. As black, your ideas are basically the same, but the positions become a bit more slow-paced, a bit more relaxed, and a bit less theoretical. The third category, anti-Sicilians, are a bit weirder. They're going to be next video's focus because they're basically the positions where white tries to be clever and come up with their own surprising theory and mess you up with that. So keep in touch for that one. But this one's going to be dealing with the closed Sicilians specifically. So the first principle is sort of understanding why you play the first 3 moves that you play. Because I'm a strong believer in understanding every move of the opening. Because I feel like if you just know what the moves are via memorization, then whenever your opponent deviates, you won't know what to do to punish them, because it'll be like, okay, so I know this is bad, but I don't know why it's bad. So we're just going to briefly go over the first 3 or 4 moves and why they exist and what you're trying to do when you play them. So e4 just develops pieces, right? And it also gains central space. Now, the most common response here is e5, but that's not what we're learning, because it also gains central space, also develops pieces. The Sicilian starts with move 1, c5, because it also keeps white from getting this ideal central pawn structure, but it does so in a more off-kilter way that immediately makes the position more dynamic. Additionally, knights behind pawns both attack the same squares. So if white plays, let's say, some random move like h3, this knight and this pawn both team up on the d4 square. They make for a pretty good combo. Additionally, you're not putting pawns in the center immediately, which means that bishops can get a little bit more active and get a bit more control on these long diagonals. So white, let's say he plays knight c3, as in the closed Sicilians we're looking at, and then you play d6. And now, the first question is, why not develop the knight immediately? The reason is because this move, while totally fine, and there is theory for this, it allows some weird lines where there's an early bishop b5 and it forces the doubling of your pawns. And d6 not only avoids all those lines, but is also a bit more flexible in general. This way, if white plays bishop to b5, checking you, then you can always block with bishop. Or if he pins your knight, then you can block with bishop still and then recapture with bishop. Additionally, it prevents the e5 pawn advance, which sometimes is an idea. And it helps open up your light squared bishop on this diagonal for future ideas as well. And so it's a very multi-purpose move. White, let's say, develops his bishop. And now, for reasons we'll explain later, you usually bring out the knight first. And your general structure is sort of this idea. Is this, like we talked about before, your sort of Draco structure, right? Which I'll briefly show off what it looks like for the black side. And the point is, you've got your knights developed towards the center actively. You've got your bishop on the long diagonal. And now, because you played c5 and not e5, this bishop is open. More open than it normally would be in e5 positions. Additionally, your bishop has the ideas of going places. And even though your light squared bishop is usually your bad piece in these positions, and you have a lot of central counterplay. So, if, for example, white were to play bishop b5 in this position, you can remember that the reason you played this is so that you could block with bishop, because white's light squared bishop is more often than not much better than yours. So trading it off often gives you good positions. There are lines that go like this, but they're often not too uncomfortable for black. The second major principle is to know your plans. One of the biggest reasons newer players struggle to find moves is because they struggle to find plans. Because once you've developed all your pieces, or roughly all your pieces, and you look at the board, it's sometimes difficult, and sometimes you think, okay, what now? And luckily in the Dragon, it's pretty simple because you have two major plans in the closed Sicilian. And that is the eventual d5 and the eventual b5, maybe with c4 for some queenside expansion. Now, d5 is often accomplished via e6 and then d5. Sometimes you can just play d5 by itself if white doesn't sufficiently defend it. Sometimes you try to trade off some of these pieces first and then play d5. In any case, once you play d5, it really opens up your bishops and knights quite nicely and gives you central counterplay that really improves your position. And oftentimes, the pieces all get liquidated down and it ends up in an endgame where you're either fine or a little bit better. The queenside counterplay with a6, b5 is a little bit more nuanced, because the point is you play a6, you play b5, oftentimes with e6 to prevent the bishop from coming to d5. And then, once white starts to retreat his pieces, you keep pushing on the queen side and in the center and gain a major spatial advantage and transition that into more active pieces and gain play that way. And that's when tactics start to show up. Oftentimes, these plans don't exist in a vacuum, and so by playing d5, you allow the a6, b5 plan to happen, or vice versa. But just knowing those two moves, the ones that you're kind of trying to play, even if it takes 5-10 moves to get there, is very helpful in finding your next one move. No, Gofra, also, great name by the way. d5 is winning for white in this position. However, what I'm talking about specifically is that it's an eventual plan. So you usually spend another 5 moves preparing d5 to be played. You know, it's a distant plan, not a next move. The third principle is probably the simplest one. And that is, if white ever plays d4, you take it, he takes with the knight, and you move on with your life, and you keep playing your plans. d4 is not scary. It looks scary because it's like, oh no, it's not a closed Sicilian anymore, he's opening things up. Oh no, theory. But it's not that big of a deal, because usually if he plays d3, then d4, then he's wasting a tempo, and if he doesn't, then his light squared bishop takes longer to get out. So either way, you're totally fine. And if he takes with bishop first, then you just take this bishop immediately, because now he has nothing to contest your dark squared bishop with. d4 is not scary in the least. And even if you've already committed something like e6, you know, trying to play d5 like we talked about, d4 takes, you can still go for d5. Not a problem whatsoever. If anything, white playing d4 in the closed Sicilian is often beneficial to the black pieces because it helps him with his plans. The queenside expansion gets easier, the central expansion gets easier, and it often wastes the tempo. So if d4 happens, you just take and you continue with your plans. Additionally, if it takes on c6, you take back. It's all good. So don't fear d4. It looks like it, in worst case scenario, you're transpositioning, which basically means you're going from you're going into different theory. You're going into the same theory from a different line. Pardon me. And so worst case scenario, you're just entering the theory we're going to talk about later, but from a different opening. Just totally fine. So nothing to be afraid of in d4. The fourth principle is relating to bishop g5, which is threatening to take the knight. Now, bishop g5, you always want to play bishop g7 first, of course, to keep him from having to double your pawns. But then, after this happens, he plays whatever move he plays. Doesn't matter. Or maybe castles here is a more natural move. You can play h6. Even if it's not the best move, which in some positions it isn't, h6 is totally fine. The reason being, because in the close Sicilian he's playing castle kingside, he doesn't have the normal g4, h4 plans that we're going to talk about in later videos. And so this h6 pawn isn't really that big of a weakness. Additionally, if he retreats his bishop, now he can never team up with his bishop and queen to try and trade off your dark squared bishop. And if he retreats his bishop this way, then after you castle and he moves his queen, you can play king h7, and once again, he can never trade off your bishop, which is always beneficial for you. And then, if he takes your knight, then you are just absolutely giddy. Absolutely giddy. Because you take back with bishop, and now this is a monster without equal. There is nothing he can do to compete with it, and black is almost always better in these positions, as long as you aren't blundering the h6 pawn or something along those lines. So the general principle here is if he plays bishop g5 earlier, and he's not threatening to double your pawns, then you can almost always reply h6. Just be careful you're not blundering the h6 pawn with some queen-bishop tactics. The fifth principle is if, according to your plans, they do try to trade out the bishop, but they don't play bishop g5 first. Now, like we said before, this bishop is incredibly strong. So, a lot of people who play the dragon, especially the closed dragon, get worried whenever this bishop's going to be traded off because they think, oh, no, I'm going to lose my strongest piece and then I'm going to lose the game. But, fortunately for you, that is almost never a major concern. Simply because you get a lot of time when they do that. If they play bishop h6, then you have time to just play e6 and then takes, and now it's very difficult for them to stop d5 because it comes so quickly. By playing this sort of bishop and then queen idea, and then playing bishop h6, they're spending like 4 or 5 moves to trade off this bishop. So, don't think of it as much as they're getting rid of your strongest piece. Think about it more as you're offering to trade your strongest piece for like 5 tempi. In that case, it's absolutely worth it because, again, the main goal of the position is either queenside counterplay or central counterplay. The bishop exists to serve that purpose. And so, trading off the bishop to give you that counterplay, that's an absolute win. So, don't fear the bishop h6. Use it to progress your plans further in the center and on the queen side. The sixth principle is the one where we start to get into more specific and weedy territory. And that is, usually, in the closed Sicilian, you want to develop your queenside knight, and then your dark squared bishop, and then your kingside knight. Which seems kind of counterintuitive, because you would think, okay, I want to develop knights for 4 bishops, then my other kingside piece, and then I want a castle. But that's not completely true, because it's a more close position, and in close positions, you can afford to delay your castling a little bit. Additionally, for reasons we'll go into in the next principle, developing your kingside knight immediately isn't a great idea. And so usually you want to start with your queenside knight. That way you're protecting the center from any pushes, because the close Sicilian can often get kind of weird with d4. And again, you just take, but it's difficult to justify taking if you don't have the knight on c6. Then you develop the dark squared bishop. That way, if you develop the knight first, he doesn't have any funny haha tactics, where let's say if you develop this knight, then here, then you develop this knight, he doesn't have any funny haha ideas to double your pawns without you being able to stop him. And so then you develop this bishop, you play g6, and then you develop your knight. Most often in that order. How to develop your knight will be the next principle, but remember, queenside knight, kingside bishop, then kingside knight. That order is almost always the case in closed Sicilian positions. In other Sicilians, other move orders will take precedence, but in closed Sicilians, queenside knight, kingside bishop, kingside knight, and then you castle. The seventh and last principle for playing the closed Sicilian is dealing with the development of your G knight, and that is, do not develop your G knight until they develop their G knight. Don't develop your kingside knight until they develop theirs. And there's a very good reason for that. So, in the closed Sicilian, white has this idea where he can play f4 and then put the knight behind f4. And the idea is he gets these central pushes, sometimes e5, sometimes f5, and it's kind of annoying to deal with. So, if he does that, then you want to play e6 and then put your knight on e7. That way your knight and pawn both guard this f5 square along with this bishop. And then when you play g6, this pawn will also guard the f5 square. So you're putting like everything on the f5 square in order to prevent that idea. However, if white puts his knight in front of the f pawn and you go for this idea, it's just slightly worse than putting your knight on f6 because your knight isn't as active on this square and the f5 square isn't as important. And so it's just not a very active move, and it's typically slightly worse for black. So the solution is like we talked about in the last tip. You develop your other pieces first and you wait for white to commit. If white plays f4, then you know, okay, e6, knight e7. And if they put the knight in front of the pawn, then you go say, okay, knight f6. Now, there's an edge case. The edge case is knight e2, which is them saying, okay, I can play f4 if I want to. I can do it. I'll do it. Don't make me do it. Play e6, put your knight on e7. It's fine. Their knight is also not as active, so you can get away with getting your knight on a less active square as well. Totally fine. And that's the last principle. And with that, you should be able to know how to develop all your pieces and then what to do afterwards. So, with those 7 principles in mind, those being why you play the first few moves, queenside expansion and central expansion, taking on d4 and not sweating it too much, meeting bishop g5 with an early h6, not fearing the trade of the dark square bishop and using it as extra time to play your plans, developing your bishop and queenside knight first, and not committing your kingside knight until they commit theirs, you should have a good grasp on how exactly to start playing the closed Sicilian positions. Now, like anything in chess, it requires practice to get good at, and feel free to visit me at twitch.tv/alchemyandbluffish in order to ask any questions you may have. I stream on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Saturdays, starting at 7 p.m. Central European Standard Time. Or ask any questions in the comments, because I'll respond to basically every comment, because I can, because I'm tiny. And thank you so much for watching. Next time, we'll go over those anti-Sicilians we were talking about earlier, and that's going to be a really interesting video, because there's a lot of interesting variations and weird ideas and funky moves there. It's going to be one of the most diverse of our videos. And I hope you have an excellent whatever time it is in your time zone. Sussy Baka. That's what it is. There you go. Congratulations. Get your clip. Get out of here. Get your clip and leave. Take it and leave.